Hey folks, here's a set of video notes for taxonomy. If you're writing down the notes, you only need to write the stuff in red. First of all, what is taxonomy? It's a fancy word for the classification of living things. It's how we categorize the organisms based on their physical characteristics and their DNA and other chemicals. So why do we classify living things? Well, it helps us to keep them organized. There's millions of living things on Earth. After we have this classification system set up and everything's organized, it helps us to answer some important questions like how many kinds of organisms are there, or what relationships are there among living things. We talked about this a bit when we talked about evolution, but scientists can look at physical characteristics like skeletal structures, and we get that from the structural data from fossil evidence. And we can look at developmental patterns, which is comparing how the organisms develop from egg to adult. They could also look at chemical characteristics like the genetic material like DNA or RNA. They could compare other chemicals like proteins or hormones. So all of those things, if you compare between two organisms, you can see how closely they're related to each other. And that helps us to organize them. There are 8 levels of classification. As you go down the list, each level gets a little more specific. So we have domain, which covers, there are 3 domains that cover all living things. And then as you go down from that, there's a certain kingdom for each of those domains, and phylums and class, order, family, genus, species, species being the very most specific. If you, well, I kind of want you to remember the order, and you can remember that by coming up with your own phrase or remembering the one I have here. Did King Philip come over from Great Spain? So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Before the 1700s, we used a 12-part classification system, and scientists weren't very smart back then, and they just used all 12 of those parts to name the organisms. Just kind of a very long name. Then we had this guy named Carolus Linnaeus who came along, and he simplified that by giving each kind of living thing a 2-part scientific name. That scientific name we call binomial nomenclature, which is the fancy phrase for the 2-part scientific name we use. We use the last 2 levels of classification, genus and species, to get that 2-part scientific name. So like the house cat here in this example, the genus is Felis and the species is Domesticus, so its scientific name is Felis domesticus. There are 3 domains that cover all living life, or all living organisms: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotes. None of them have a nucleus. For bacteria, they often have a cell wall, and they can live in most environments. But archaea is mostly found in extreme environments like hot springs and thermal vents, and some are found in the ocean. And then eukarya is everything that has a nucleus. So that's a pretty big domain. We'll look a little bit further into eukarya because it relates to us. There are 4 kingdoms within the domain eukarya. Those 4 kingdoms are Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. Animalia includes all multicellular cellular organisms with no cell walls, which is essentially all the animals. They can usually move around, and they eat other organisms to get their food. The kingdom Plantae, and this includes multicellular organisms that do have cell walls, and that's all the plants. They can't move around, they make their own food, and they're found where light's found. Fungi, that's what you want to take to a party, is a real fun guy. These have cells with cell walls, but they don't have chloroplasts, so they don't make their own food like plants do. They actually use their own digestive juices to break down the materials around them, and then they absorb it. These are things like yeasts and molds and mushrooms. And Protista, these are single-celled or very simple multicellular organisms like algae or protozoans and slime molds. And they've got some characteristics of all 3 of the other kingdoms. We can illustrate our relationships between species using branching diagrams, which are also known as cladograms. Sorry. The farther right you go on a cladogram, the more specific you get. So everything to the right of a characteristic labeled here, everything to the right, all the organisms to the right of that characteristic have that characteristic. Everything to the left does not. Or if you look at the organism, it has all the characteristics to the left of it, but nothing to the right of it. So if you're looking for something that has jaws, a hagfish doesn't have jaws, but perch and salamander, lizard, and all these do. If you're looking for something that has feathers, then you can go all the way up here. It's got feathers, but a mouse and chimp don't have feathers. That actually kind of branches off there. That's a weird example. If you're looking for claws or nails, all of these have claws or nails, but a salamander, a perch, and a hagfish do not. And we'll do some practice with that later. And then to identify an organism, you could use a dichotomous key, which can also be set up as a flowchart. To use a dichotomous key, you look at the organism, look at the characteristics, and you start with number 1 always. And it asks you, does it have needle leaves or non-needle leaves? And it doesn't look like it has needles to me, so you go non-needle leaves, then you follow the direction. It says go to question 3. And you go to there and keep doing it. And we'll also have more practice with that. And that, I believe, is the end of your notes. If you have any questions, let me know.